Ethan Cade adjusted the strap on his gear pack, stepping carefully over the thick, bioluminescent roots that crisscrossed the jungle floor. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the hum of unseen creatures. His breath fogged slightly in the alien humidity, and his boots made almost no sound against the moss-covered ground. The dense foliage pressed in from all sides, and he had to remind himself that he wasn't alone in this wilderness. Not really. The research team's outpost was miles away, and he'd volunteered for this survey trip under the pretense of gathering more data on the planet's native fauna. But the truth was, Ethan preferred being out here, alone. There was something about the untamed wilds of an alien world that spoke to him more than the sterile walls of a lab. The data recorder in his hand beeped softly, detecting a faint energy signature ahead. He frowned. The jungle had a strange way of playing tricks on his instruments, but this signal was different, subtle, shifting, almost as if it was moving with intent. He adjusted the settings, trying to pinpoint its source when something made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. A presence. He wasn't alone. Ethan turned slowly, scanning the trees, the ferns, the thick vines that hung like curtains between the trunks. He saw nothing, but his instincts told him otherwise. Years of working in hostile environments had sharpened his awareness, and right now, every fiber of his being told him he was being watched. A branch rustled to his right. He spun toward the movement, heart pounding, eyes narrowing as he searched for any sign of what had disturbed it. His grip tightened on the pulse scanner, which was now picking up a barely perceptible anomaly in the air just ahead of him. It was as if something was there, but not quite visible, like a shimmer in the fabric of reality itself. And then, without warning, the air in front of him shifted. The distortion wavered, and before his eyes, she appeared. She was standing barely 10 feet away, her form gradually materializing as if a veil had been lifted. Silver-blue skin gleamed under the soft glow of the jungle's bioluminescent flora. Long, translucent hair rippled like liquid light, shifting in color between hues of deep amethyst and pale azure. She was tall, slender, yet powerful, her violet eyes wide with shock as they locked onto his, and she was completely, unmistakably, naked. Ethan froze, his brain struggling to catch up with what he was seeing. Every rational thought in his head short-circuited at once. The alien woman's expression shifted in an instant from surprise to horror. Her hands shot up as if to cover herself, but she had no clothing, no armor, nothing to conceal her form. A strangled gasp escaped her lips, and she staggered back, her body flickering as if she was trying to activate whatever cloaking ability had failed her. But it wasn't working. Ethan blinked, forcing himself to look away to give her a shred of dignity despite the surreal situation. His mind raced. Who was she? How had she remained hidden? Was she alone? And why, above all things, had she thought she was invisible? The woman took another step back, her body trembling. She clutched at her chest, her bioluminescence pulsing erratically in a way that almost looked like fear. She said something in a language he didn't recognize, her voice soft but filled with urgency. He lifted his hands slowly, palms open, the universal sign of peace. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, keeping his voice low, calm. She flinched, her eyes darting between his face and the device in his hand. Realizing that the scanner might seem threatening, he slowly lowered it, letting it hang loosely at his side. "Can you understand me?" He tried again. Her lips parted, hesitation flickering across her face. Then, to his astonishment, she spoke. Her voice was melodious, uncertain, but her words were unmistakably in his language. "You see me?" Ethan frowned. "Yeah, I see you." A sharp breath escaped her, as if this was the worst possible answer he could have given. She took another step back, visibly distressed. "Impossible," she whispered. He shook his head, confused. "Look, I don't know who you are, but I swear I'm not here to hurt you. What are you doing out here?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned suddenly, her body tense as if she was ready to flee into the jungle. But she hesitated, glancing back at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. A mix of disbelief, fear, and something else. "Wait," Ethan said, taking a cautious step forward. "I can help you." Her gaze snapped back to him, her slit-pupil eyes narrowing. "No one can help me." Before he could respond, she moved fast. She shot past him, a blur of silver and blue disappearing into the jungle's dense undergrowth. Ethan reacted on instinct, lunging after her. "Wait!" He crashed through the foliage, branches whipping against his arms, his boots sinking into the damp earth as he followed her through the darkness. The energy signature from before was now pulsing erratically on his scanner, and for the first time he realized she had been the anomaly all along. A hidden species, a living ghost in the jungle, he pushed forward, determined not to lose her. The terrain became uneven, the jungle floor giving way to rocky outcroppings. Then, suddenly, the ground beneath his feet disappeared. Ethan tumbled forward, gravity yanking him down. His body collided with the earth below, rolling hard before coming to a stop. Pain lanced through his side, but before he could even register what had happened, a shadow loomed over him. She was standing above him, no longer trying to run, no longer trying to hide. And in her glowing violet eyes, Ethan saw something he hadn't expected: curiosity. Ethan groaned, pushing himself up onto his elbows. His body ached from the fall, but his attention was locked on the alien woman standing over him. Her glowing violet eyes studied him, her expression caught between caution and curiosity. He didn't move. Any sudden motion might startle her again, and if she vanished this time, he doubted he'd be able to track her. Instead, he met her gaze, leveling his breathing. "You run fast," he said, his voice dry but calm. The woman tilted her head, her translucent hair shifting like liquid light. "You follow fast," she replied. Her accent was strange, syllables slightly clipped, almost musical. Ethan exhaled, his pulse still racing from the chase. "Didn't have much of a choice. You kind of appeared out of nowhere." She narrowed her eyes slightly, her gaze flicking to his scanner, then back to his face. "You are different," Ethan hesitated. "Different how? You see me," she said again, her voice quieter this time. Her bioluminescent skin pulsed faintly, her body language tense, uncertain. "You should not be able to." Ethan shifted, sitting up fully but keeping his movements slow. "Why not?" she hesitated, glancing toward the thick jungle behind her as if expecting something or someone to emerge. Then she looked back at him. "Because I am hidden," Ethan frowned. "Not anymore," her expression darkened. "Yes, and that is a problem." Something in the way she said it sent a chill down his spine. He wasn't sure if she meant a problem for him or for herself, but either way, it didn't sound good. "Listen," he said carefully. "I don't know who you are or why you think you're invisible, but I'm not here to hurt you. My name's Ethan." He placed a hand over his chest in introduction. She studied him, her gaze flickering with something unreadable. Then, after a long pause, she murmured, "Sira." Sira. The name suited her, soft yet strong, mysterious. "Okay, Sira," he said slowly. "Why were you out here alone?" She hesitated, then took a slow step back. "I should not be here." Ethan caught the subtle shift in her posture, the way her muscles tensed, ready to flee again. "Then why are you?" Her lips parted, but before she could answer, a distant sound echoed through the jungle. A deep, resonant hum, like the call of something vast and powerful. Sira stiffened instantly. Her bioluminescence dimmed, her breathing sharp and fast. "What was that?" Ethan asked, scanning the darkness beyond. Sira's gaze snapped back to him, urgent now. "You must leave." Ethan shook his head. "Not without answers." "You do not understand," she hissed, stepping closer. "If they find you, if they know you see me," she cut herself off, frustration flashing across her face. "Go." Ethan clenched his jaw. He wasn't the type to walk away from something like this, especially not when the person in front of him was clearly terrified. "Not happening," he said. "Tell me what's going on and maybe I can help." Sira exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You cannot, you are only—" The hum came again. This time it was closer. Sira cursed in a language he didn't understand. Her body flickered in an attempt to vanish, but again it failed. Ethan's gut twisted. Whatever was coming, it was something she feared. And if she was right, it might be hunting her. "Come with me," he said. "My camp's a few miles out. It's safe there." She turned, her eyes scanning the jungle's depths. The hesitation was clear. Trust was not something she gave easily. Another pulse of the hum. This time the undergrowth trembled. Sira's expression tightened. She looked back at Ethan. Then, against whatever instincts told her otherwise, she reached out. "Run." Ethan grabbed her hand, and together they ran. The jungle blurred around them as Ethan and Sira sprinted through the dense foliage. Vines snagged at his arms. Roots threatened to trip him, but he kept going, matching Sira's pace. The hum behind them grew louder, reverberating through his ribs like the pulse of some massive beast. Ethan risked a glance over his shoulder. Shadows flickered through the trees, shapes shifting in the darkness. His breath hitched. He couldn't see them clearly, but something was there, something moving fast. "Sira, do not stop," she snapped, her grip on his hand tightening. Ethan pushed forward, ignoring the burn in his legs. He didn't know what was chasing them, but he knew one thing: Sira was terrified. And if something scared her, it had to be serious. They crashed through a wall of hanging vines, emerging into a narrow ravine. Steep rock walls flanked them on either side, slick with moisture from the heavy jungle air. The only way forward was through a rocky passage barely wide enough for them to squeeze through. Sira yanked him toward it. In here, they slipped between the jagged rocks, pressing close to fit. The stone was cool against Ethan's skin, rough and uneven. Sira's glowing form dimmed further, her body language tense, alert. Then the hum stopped. Silence. Ethan held his breath. The jungle, once alive with distant calls of strange creatures, was utterly still. No insects, no rustling leaves. Just an unnatural void. Sira barely breathed. Her hand remained clenched around his, her pulse quick and unsteady beneath his fingers. Minutes stretched, then a faint clicking sound echoed through the ravine. A soft, rhythmic pattern, almost like language. It came from somewhere just beyond the rock passage, where the jungle floor was hidden in darkness. Ethan's stomach tightened. Whatever was out there, it was close. Sira pressed a finger to her lips. A silent warning. Ethan nodded. The clicking sound shifted, morphing into a deep, guttural chittering. Shapes flickered in the dim light, shifting between the trees. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, they vanished. The jungle remained silent for another agonizing minute before Sira exhaled, sagging slightly against the rock wall. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. Sira hesitated. Then finally she spoke. "Hunters." Ethan frowned. "Hunters?" "As in people," she shook her head. "Not in the way you understand. They do not kill for food. They do not kill for survival. They kill because they are designed to." Ethan stared at her, his mind racing. "And they were hunting you?" Sira nodded slowly. "Yes." Ethan swallowed hard. "Why?" She hesitated, shifting against the stone. "Because I am not supposed to exist." That answer sent a chill through him. "What does that mean?" Sira glanced at him, her glowing violet eyes unreadable. "It means," she said softly, "I was never meant to be seen." Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. Whatever she was, whatever secrets she carried, they were dangerous. And now, because he had seen her, he was part of it too. Ethan's mind spun as the weight of Sira's words settled over him. He was in deep, far deeper than he had ever intended. He had only wanted to survive, to find some way off this God-forsaken planet. But now, standing here in the darkness with her, he realized he wasn't just running from danger. He was running with it. Sira pressed a palm against the damp rock, closing her eyes. A faint shimmer of energy rippled over her skin, illuminating the narrow passage for a brief moment before fading. Whatever she was doing, it seemed to steady her. When she opened her eyes again, they locked onto his. "You should leave," she murmured. "Now, before they return." Ethan let out a breathless laugh. "Leave and go where? In case you haven't noticed, I'm stuck here too." Sira's expression tightened. "You are not part of this. If they discover you are helping me—" "Helping," he cut in, voice edged with disbelief. "Sira, I don't even know what's going on. One minute I'm trying to survive. The next I'm running from invisible death machines with a—" He stopped himself before saying naked alien girl. Something about it felt wrong now. "With someone I barely understand." Sira looked away, as if choosing her words carefully. "I was created to be unseen," she finally said. "My kind, our purpose, was never meant to be known, but I am flawed." Her voice dipped lower, almost ashamed. "I can be seen, and because of that I must be erased." Ethan's heart pounded. "Erased," he echoed. She nodded, jaw set. "They will not stop hunting me." The words hung between them, heavy and unshakable. Ethan swallowed, feeling an unfamiliar heat stir in his chest. Anger? No, not quite. Determination. "So what?" he said. "You're just planning to keep running until they catch you." Sira tensed, her gaze sharp. "I do not plan on being caught." Ethan exhaled through his nose. "Right, because that always works out." He stepped forward, closing the space between them slightly. "Look, I get it. You've survived on your own for a long time. But I have a feeling that if running was going to save you, you wouldn't be here now. You need a plan. A real one." Sira studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the truth in his words. Then, slowly, her shoulders dropped the slightest bit. "There may be a way," she admitted. Ethan arched a brow. "I'm listening." She hesitated before continuing. "My people leave no records, no trace. We are not supposed to exist, and so we do not. But if I could reach a beacon, one of their communication relays, I could make my presence undeniable. If I expose myself to the wider network, they will have no choice but to acknowledge me. The hunt would have to stop." Ethan frowned. "And if they don't stop," Sira's lips pressed together, "then they risk revealing themselves to the universe. They fear exposure more than anything." It was a risky plan, a desperate one, but at least it was something. Ethan sighed. "Okay, where's this beacon?" Sira lifted her gaze toward the sky, the faint glow of the distant moons reflecting in her violet eyes. "Far," Ethan huffed. "Figures." A faint flicker of amusement passed over her face. It was gone just as quickly, but for the first time he saw it, the tiniest crack in her guarded exterior. He rolled his shoulders, glancing down at his scratched-up arms and torn shirt. "Well," he muttered, "I guess we'd better get moving before your invisible murder squad decides to come back." Sira watched him carefully, as if still uncertain whether to trust him. But finally, she nodded, and for the first time she reached for his hand on her own. It was a small gesture, a silent agreement, but Ethan felt its weight all the same. The journey to the beacon was treacherous. They moved through dense, alien foliage that pulsed with bioluminescent veins, the terrain shifting unpredictably beneath their feet. Strange sounds echoed in the distance, some distant, others too close for comfort. Yet through it all, Sira remained impossibly light on her feet, her movements fluid and deliberate, as if the world itself barely noticed her presence. Ethan, on the other hand, stumbled. "A lot. You always walk this loudly." Sira whispered at one point, her hand darting out to steady him as his boots sank into what he could only describe as a pulsating moss pit. "Not my fault the ground keeps trying to eat me," he grumbled, wrenching his foot free with a wet squelch. She didn't respond, but he swore he saw the ghost of a smirk before she turned away. They pressed on, navigating rocky inclines and tangled undergrowth, always aware that Sira's pursuers could be anywhere, every shadow a potential threat. Ethan found himself watching her more than he probably should. The way her violet eyes scanned the terrain with quiet intensity. The way she moved, her steps soundless, her presence ghost-like. Even her breathing seemed controlled, disciplined. He couldn't shake the thought she was trained for this. She wasn't just surviving. She had spent her life hiding, fighting, running, and she was tired of it. After hours of travel, they finally reached a plateau overlooking a vast expanse of jagged, metallic structures jutting from the ground like skeletal remains. The beacon. It was taller than Ethan had expected, a spire of interwoven alien material stretching into the sky, crackling with faint energy. "There," Sira said, voice tight. "That is where we must go." Ethan exhaled. "Great, and I'm guessing it's not unguarded." She shook her head. "They will be watching." Of course they would. Nothing was ever easy. Ethan crouched beside her, studying the structures below. From this height he couldn't see any movement, but that didn't mean much. "What's the plan?" Sira hesitated. "I will go alone." Ethan's head snapped toward her. "Excuse me." "It is too dangerous for you." His jaw clenched. "You don't get to decide that." Her eyes flickered with something unreadable. "If they see you, they will not hesitate." Ethan scoffed. "Right, because they're really gonna give you a warm welcome." Silence stretched between them. Then softer, he added, "We do this together or not at all." Sira stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then with a slow exhale she nodded. "Together." Ethan tried to ignore the way his chest tightened at the word. They descended toward the beacon, slipping through the remains of whatever civilization had once called this place home. The structures were strange, half organic, half mechanical, as if grown rather than built. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the silence became. Then the air shifted. Sira froze. Ethan felt it too, a disturbance, a subtle hum that raised the hairs on the back of his neck. "We are not alone," she whispered. Ethan tightened his grip on the rusted metal rod he had scavenged earlier. Not exactly a great weapon, but better than nothing. Figures. Then a ripple. The air shimmered, distorting like heat waves, and suddenly, movement. Ethan barely had time to react before the first one struck. The attack came like a ghost in the wind, silent, swift, and almost invisible. Ethan barely registered the flicker of movement before something struck his chest, sending him sprawling backward into the metallic ground. His ribs screamed in protest as he scrambled to get up, heart hammering. Sira moved like liquid shadow. Her form blurred, twisting in midair as she dodged an unseen assailant, her body knowing where to be before the attack even landed. Then, for just a breath, Ethan saw them, not entirely invisible but close. The attackers wore shimmering cloaks of shifting light, refracting the surroundings like living mirages. Ethan caught a flicker of a sharp, inhuman face beneath one hood before it vanished again. Not just hunters. Assassins. Sira's hands flicked outward, and suddenly, two of them were writhing in midair, gasping as if unseen hands crushed the breath from their lungs. She twisted her fingers and they collapsed into the dirt. Ethan had no time to be stunned. Another one appeared right in front of him. He swung the metal rod, felt the satisfying crack of impact against something solid, then watched in horror as the assassin barely flinched. A hand shot out, fingers closing around Ethan's throat. A pulse of heat surged through his body, panic, adrenaline, fear. He thrashed, but the grip was unyielding. He caught glimpses of something beneath the assassin's shifting cloak, pale skin marked with bioluminescent lines, eyes black as voids. Then Sira was there. She moved without hesitation, pressing her palm against the assassin's chest. A flicker of energy. A low, vibrating hum, and the assassin crumpled lifeless. Ethan collapsed, coughing. His throat burned, his mind racing to keep up. "Remind me," he gasped, "never to piss you off." Sira didn't smile. She turned, scanning the area. "More will come. We must move." Ethan forced himself upright, swallowing against the raw pain in his throat. Right, no time for a victory dance. They ran. The beacon loomed ahead, crackling with alien energy. It pulsed, almost alive, the towering structure humming as they approached. Sira reached the control panel first, her fingers moving with precise familiarity across the strange, glowing symbols. Ethan stood at her back, scanning the shadows for more attackers, his heart refusing to slow. "What exactly are you doing?" he asked, eyes darting between the symbols and her focused expression. "Sending a distress signal," she murmured. "A call for my people." Ethan hesitated. "And they'll actually come." She looked at him then, something unreadable in her gaze. "They will have no choice." That wasn't exactly comforting. The console flared brighter, the beacon's hum intensifying. Ethan felt the shift in the air, like the moment before a storm. Then a sound, a deep, mechanical thrum, growing louder by the second. Ethan turned and felt his stomach drop. Descending from the sky was a massive ship, sleek and dark, moving with impossible grace. It wasn't a rescue, it was a warship. Sira's expression hardened. "They found us." The warship descended with an eerie silence, its vast shadow swallowing the ruins beneath it. Ethan felt the hairs on his arms rise as a low, thrumming vibration pulsed through the air, a kind of sonic pressure that pressed against his chest. His instincts screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere left to go. Sira's hands hovered over the control panel, her body taut with tension. Ethan could see the glow of the beacon reflecting in her violet eyes, flickering as calculations and outcomes spun in her mind. "They tracked the signal," she said, voice tight. Ethan clenched his jaw. "Yeah, figured that much. Are these your people or—" She shook her head. "Not mine. The ones who hunt me. The ones who wanted her dead." The beacon's hum shifted, its pulses growing irregular, frantic. Ethan didn't know much about alien tech, but even he could tell that something was wrong. Sira exhaled sharply. "They are jamming the transmission." Ethan swore under his breath. So much for the cavalry. A piercing beam of white light shot down from the warship, striking the ground just meters away. The earth trembled, sending cracks through the metallic ruins. Shapes began emerging from the haze, figures draped in the same shifting cloaks as the assassins from before. Only this time, there were dozens of them. Ethan gripped his makeshift weapon tighter, though he knew it wouldn't do much good. "Please tell me you've got a plan." Sira didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped forward, eyes locked on the descending figures. Her posture had changed, no longer tense and desperate, but poised, as if facing an inevitability she had been preparing for her whole life. "I am the plan," she said. Before Ethan could protest, she moved. A sharp gust of wind kicked up around her, carrying with it an unnatural hum that seemed to ripple through the very air itself. The approaching assassins faltered for a moment, their forms flickering as if struggling to maintain their concealment. Then Sira lifted her hands. A wave of invisible force exploded outward, slamming into the closest figures and sending them sprawling. Their cloaks shimmered and failed, revealing lithe, pale-skinned forms etched with glowing, bioluminescent lines. Ethan barely had time to register their alien features before Sira struck again, her energy rippling through the ground like a living current. The assassins recovered quickly, too quickly. Ethan saw movement to their left, a blur of motion streaking towards Sira's exposed side. He acted on instinct. With a desperate lunge, he intercepted the attacker, his weapon colliding with their midsection. It was like hitting solid steel. The assassin barely reacted before twisting toward him, a curved blade sliding from the folds of their cloak. Ethan ducked. The blade whistled past his ear, so close he felt the heat of its energy crackle against his skin. He twisted, shoving his shoulder into the assassin's center of mass. It wasn't graceful, but it bought him a second. A second was all Sira needed. She turned, her gaze locking onto Ethan's attacker. With a flick of her fingers, the assassin's body seized, lifted from the ground by an unseen force. They let out a strangled sound before Sira clenched her fist, and the air around them collapsed. The assassin crumpled, unmoving. Ethan exhaled shakily. That was more coming. Sira cut in. He followed her gaze. She was right. The first wave had been nothing more than scouts. Now a second wave was approaching, faster, more coordinated. The warship above loomed ever closer, its presence suffocating. Sira turned back to the beacon. We must finish the transmission. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. And how exactly do we do that when they're literally jamming it? She hesitated. Then, as if making a choice she had been dreading, she reached into the folds of her garment and pulled something free, a small, metallic device. Ethan frowned. What is that? A failsafe. Something in her voice made his stomach tighten. Before he could ask, Sira moved with purpose, pressing the device against the beacon's central console. The glow of the structure flared violently, its hum turning into a sharp, high-pitched frequency that sent a shudder through Ethan's bones. The warship above reacted instantly, its lights flashing in rapid sequences. The figures on the ground hesitated, as if sensing something was very, very wrong. Ethan's instinct screamed. "Sira, what did you do?" She turned to him. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes held something that made his breath catch. "This will overload their jamming field," she said. But the energy release, a deep, resonant pulse shook the air. The beacon was building towards something. Sira stepped toward him. "You must leave." Ethan's chest tightened. "What? No, that's not. There is no time," she snapped, her voice uncharacteristically sharp. "I can contain the blast, but I need you to get clear." Ethan stared at her, mind racing. He knew what this was. She was sacrificing herself. His throat tightened. "I didn't come all this way just to watch you die." She hesitated, the first crack in her composure. The warship above shifted, its underside glowing with a mounting charge. The assassins were withdrawing, retreating from whatever storm was about to break. The beacon's glow reached a blinding intensity. Sira swallowed, something flickering behind her gaze. "You have already seen me," she murmured. When no one else could. Ethan didn't think. He grabbed her wrist. "Then you know I'm not leaving you behind." The beacon's energy surged, and in that instant, everything erupted into chaos. The explosion rocked the ground beneath them with the force of 1,000 storms. The very air seemed to fracture, shattering into a blinding cascade of light and sound that left Ethan reeling. He instinctively threw his arm across his face, but it did little to shield him from the sheer intensity of the blast. Sira's grip on him tightened, pulling him to the ground as the energy wave surged outward. The shock wave hit like a wall, flinging everything in its path away, ruins, debris, and even the assassins scattered in every direction. For a moment, Ethan thought the world had ended. But through the haze of dust and debris he heard her voice, cracked, strained, but undeniably present. "Ethan," she gasped. "Get up, now." He shook his head, trying to clear the ringing in his ears. His vision blurred as he tried to make sense of the chaos around him, but there she was, Sira, standing tall, her hair whipping around her face like a storm, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly intensity. She was alive, but not untouched. Her body shimmered with residual energy, her skin faintly crackling with the aftereffects of the overload. Her form flickered, as if reality itself couldn't quite hold her in place. The tension in the air was thick with the raw power that coursed through her, like an electric charge that wanted to tear everything apart. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "We need to leave. Now." Ethan tried to stand, but his legs were unsteady. The blast had left him disoriented, his senses scrambled. Still, he pushed himself up, instinctively reaching for her. "Where do we go?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "There is a ship," she said. "We don't have time for questions. Trust me." Sira didn't wait for him to respond. She moved like a force of nature, already on her feet and pulling him along with her. Ethan struggled to keep up, his mind still reeling from the explosion and the events that had unfolded in the past few hours. The warship above was beginning to move again, its massive hull shifting with purpose. But it was no longer the only danger. The energy pulse from the beacon had created a rift, a tear in the fabric of the atmosphere that now swirled with a chaotic, violent force. Dark shapes, beings not quite human, emerged from the rift, their forms shifting and shifting, barely tangible but undeniably there. They were coming for them. Sira pulled Ethan into a narrow alleyway, the remnants of a once great structure now reduced to a skeletal frame. The distant hum of the warship's engines echoed ominously in the background. She didn't break stride, her steps steady despite the madness around them. "What is that?" Ethan asked, looking over his shoulder at the rift. "An opening," she said, her voice low. "A door to another world. It won't be stable for long." Ethan didn't need any further explanation. He could feel the tremors of instability in the air, the ground beneath their feet shifting like the earth itself was unsteady. Whatever this was, it was far beyond his understanding. "I'm not leaving you," he muttered, though it wasn't a question. Sira didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stopped in front of a rusted hatch, pulling out a small, triangular device. It fit into the palm of her hand and she slid it into the slot beside the hatch. The metal groaned, and then with a hiss of escaping pressure, the door creaked open. Ethan took one last look at the swirling rift in the sky. It was growing larger, the dark shapes becoming more distinct. He could feel the weight of their gaze, the ominous sense that whatever was coming through the rift would not be kind. Sira stepped inside the ship, and Ethan followed, closing the hatch behind him. The interior was a stark contrast to the outside world. Sleek, smooth surfaces met his eyes, illuminated by soft, pulsing lights. But there was little time for admiration. "We need to move. The rift won't hold them back for long," Sira said, already at the controls. Ethan stumbled to her side, trying to make sense of the controls in front of them. There were symbols, alien, foreign symbols, and yet somehow they felt strangely familiar. "Where are we going?" he asked, his mind still racing to catch up. Sira's fingers danced across the controls, the ship responding with a low hum. "Away from here, far from here." Ethan glanced over at her. She looked like she was in a trance, her focus entirely on the task at hand. She was calm, too calm for the situation at hand. The ship was beginning to lift off the ground, the air around them vibrating with the hum of powerful engines. "You've been planning this, haven't you?" he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Sira's lips curved ever so slightly, a faint, almost sad smile. "I have no other choice." Ethan looked out the viewport, watching the rift grow wider and more unstable. The dark shapes were closer now, moving in perfect synchronization as they reached toward the ship. He could almost feel their hunger, and then he understood this wasn't just about survival. It wasn't just about escaping a war. It was about something deeper, Sira's people, her past. Everything that had been left behind. She wasn't just running from them. She was running for something. As the ship ascended, Ethan braced himself for the turbulence ahead. But for the first time, as they broke through the atmosphere and left the chaos of the planet behind, he felt the weight of everything they had shared settle between them. The danger wasn't over, but he wasn't alone anymore. Sira's grip on the controls tightened as the rift finally closed behind them, the darkness vanishing with a final, resounding crack. "We're safe," she murmured, her voice soft. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The ship drifted through the vast, empty space, and Ethan found himself looking at her in a new light. She wasn't just the alien girl from another world. She was more than that, and maybe, just maybe, they had both found a place in this strange universe where they belonged. As the stars stretched out before them, Ethan reached for her hand, his touch tentative but sure. Sira looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. Then, without a word, she squeezed his hand, a silent promise. This was only the beginning. The stars around them were a blur, distant pinpricks of light stretching as the ship accelerated into the vast unknown. Sira's fingers danced across the controls, her expression one of intense focus, her brow furrowed as she navigated through the void. Ethan, still struggling to comprehend the whirlwind of events that had transpired, leaned back in his seat, staring at the shimmering stars that now surrounded them. The ship hummed with a soft, almost soothing energy, a stark contrast to the chaos of the world they had left behind. The tension in the air had lessened, but it was still there, like an undercurrent that wouldn't let go. "I didn't think we'd make it out," Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. The weight of the escape hung in the air between them, a shared understanding of the dangers they just faced. Sira didn't immediately respond, her focus entirely on the ship's systems. It was almost as if she was retreating into herself, and for a brief moment, Ethan felt the distance between them widen. He had thought that their bond, forged in the heat of battle and shared danger, would have been enough to bring them closer. But Sira wasn't like him. She wasn't human, and there was still so much he didn't understand. After a long, heavy silence, she finally spoke. "You don't know what it's like," her voice soft but cutting through the quiet like a blade, "to always be on the run, to never have a place to call your own." Ethan shifted in his seat, the weight of her words settling over him. He could hear the pain in her voice, the years of fleeing, of never being able to settle down, of always looking over your shoulder. It was a feeling he could never truly grasp, not in the same way she did. But it was a feeling he wanted to understand. "Then tell me," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Tell me what it's like. Let me help you." She turned to look at him then, her gaze piercing yet soft, like she was seeing him for the first time. The dim lighting of the ship illuminated her features, casting shadows that made her seem both ethereal and untouchable. But her eyes, those were the eyes of someone who had seen far too much, someone who had borne the weight of the universe on their shoulders for far too long. "One day I thought I could stop running," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "I thought I could stay, but then they found me. Again." The words hung in the air like a secret, unspoken and heavy. The realization hit Ethan with the force of a punch to the gut. She wasn't just running from enemies. She wasn't just running from the past. She was running from her own people, her own kind. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. The rift they had escaped from, the creatures that had come through, it all clicked into place. "What do they want from you?" Sira hesitated, her gaze faltering for a moment before she finally answered. "They want to use me, to control me, to make me into something I'm not." Ethan frowned, confusion and concern pulling at his features. "You mean, they're not just trying to kill you, they want to use you?" Sira's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes, I'm a weapon to them. I was born to be one." The words stung, cutting through the air with an edge of raw emotion. Ethan felt a surge of protectiveness rise within him. This wasn't just some war she was caught in. This was something much deeper, something far more personal. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sira looked away, her hands tightening on the controls. "I didn't want to bring you into this. I didn't want you to be a part of my fight." Ethan stood up, moving toward her with determination. "You don't get to decide that for me, Sira. I'm already in this. I already care about you." Her eyes flicked to him, surprise flashing across her face. But then, just as quickly, her expression hardened and she turned away again, her fingers flying over the controls. "You don't know what you're getting into," she said, her voice edged with something between fear and regret. "You have no idea the kind of enemies I'm running from. The kind of power they have." Ethan stood there for a moment, watching her struggle with something he couldn't see. He could feel the tension in the air, the invisible barrier she had erected around herself. But he wasn't going to back down, not now. "I don't care," he said firmly. "I'm not leaving you, not now, not ever." For a moment there was silence. Then Sira finally turned to face him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt, any trace of uncertainty, but there was nothing but determination in his gaze. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why do you care?" Ethan stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "Because you're not alone anymore. I'm here, Sira, and I'm not going anywhere." She studied him for a long moment, her eyes scanning his face, weighing his words. Then, slowly, something in her shifted. The cold barrier she had built around herself cracked just enough for him to see the vulnerability beneath. The fear, the loneliness, the uncertainty. And in that moment, Ethan knew. She didn't just need protection. She needed someone who would stand by her, not because of some sense of duty or obligation, but because he cared about her, because he loved her. Sira reached out then, her fingers brushing against his in a quiet gesture of connection. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer than it had ever been before. Ethan smiled, gently taking her hand in his. "You don't have to thank me. We're in this together, all the way." She nodded, a small but genuine smile tugging at the corners of her lips. And for the first time since they had met, Ethan felt the weight of their connection, the bond they shared, settle in a way that felt right. As the stars continued to streak past them, the ship hummed steadily through the void, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. As the stars continued to blur into streaks of light, Ethan and Sira settled into an unspoken rhythm. The hum of the ship was a constant, grounding them in the quiet cocoon of space as they headed further into the unknown. Ethan had thought that joining Sira on this journey would be about survival, about escaping the forces that sought to tear them apart. But somewhere along the way, he had realized it was more than that. This was about connection, about finding a home in each other, even among the stars. Their bond had grown in a way that neither had expected. What had begun as mutual need, Sira needing someone to trust and Ethan needing a purpose, had evolved into something deeper. There was an understanding between them now, a shared vulnerability that made them more than just allies. They were partners, in every sense of the word. The ship's controls had become second nature to Sira, her fingers moving across the console with a practiced ease. Ethan sat next to her, watching her with a quiet admiration. The weight of her past, the burden she carried, had not vanished, but it was clear she wasn't facing it alone anymore. Sira finally spoke, her voice low but steady. "We're almost there." Ethan glanced at the navigational map on the screen, seeing the small dot that represented their destination. It was a remote planet, a place that held the answers Sira had been running from, the place where her people would be waiting. He wasn't sure what would happen when they arrived. Would they be met with hostility? Would her people welcome her back, or would they see her as a traitor? He didn't know. But he did know one thing. Whatever happened, they would face it together. Sira's gaze flickered to him, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had shared, of the unspoken bond that had developed between them. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper, "I don't know what's going to happen when we get there, but I want you to know, no matter what, I'm glad we met. I'm glad I'm not alone anymore." Ethan's heart tightened at the sincerity in her voice. He reached over, taking her hand in his once more, his grip firm and reassuring. "You'll never be alone again," he replied, his voice filled with certainty. "We'll face it all together." For a moment, there was nothing but the quiet hum of the ship and the steady beat of their hearts in the stillness of space. No words were needed. Their shared understanding was enough. The tension that had once marked their every interaction had melted away, replaced with a calm certainty that they were in this, no matter what. The planet loomed ahead, its surface a swirl of colors that hinted at both beauty and danger. Sira's fingers hesitated over the controls for a moment, her breath catching in her chest. This was it. The place she had been running from, the place that held the answers to the questions that had haunted her for so long. But this time, she wasn't running. She was choosing to face it head-on with someone by her side who understood her, who loved her not despite her past but because of it. "We'll figure this out," Ethan said, as if reading her thoughts. "Together." Sira nodded, her throat tight, and with one final glance at him, she set the course for the planet. The ship began its descent, the stars outside growing dimmer as they entered the atmosphere. It was time. As the planet grew larger, Sira could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She had never been more terrified in her life, but she also had never felt more certain of one thing. No matter what came next, no matter what her people said or did, she had someone to face it with, someone who wouldn't leave her. The ship touched down on the surface with a gentle thud, the engines whirring down to a soft hum. Sira released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and turned to look at Ethan. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, full of emotion. Ethan met her gaze, his face calm but resolute. He nodded, always. They stood up together, the weight of the moment settling over them. The doors of the ship opened with a hiss, revealing the alien landscape before them. It was a strange, alien world, with towering mountains and strange, bioluminescent flora that bathed the landscape in an eerie glow. But the world itself wasn't as important as what was waiting for them. Sira stepped forward, her hand still tightly gripping Ethan's, and together they walked into the unknown. This was where the journey had led them, and no matter what they found, they would face it together. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They were no longer alone. And whatever came next, they would face it with love, with trust, and with the strength they had gained in each other's arms. As they walked into the world that awaited them, the stars above seemed to shine a little brighter. The vastness of the universe no longer felt empty or cold, but full of possibility. Together they could conquer anything. Together they were unstoppable. And that was all that mattered.